And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, it's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And if you love what we're doing and you want even more content, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, and get exclusive access to bonus content. For more information on the benefits of supporting us through Patreon, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s. And today, we approach the beginning of the end of our journey up my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1963. On 6 previous episodes, we covered films 10 through 5, From Russia with Love, This Sporting Life, a documentary called Crisis Behind a Presidential Commitment, The Great Escape, The Organizer, and The Birds. And today, we move on to numbers 4 and 3. So without further ado, the Best of 63 at the Movies Part 7, right now. And my fourth ranked film for 63 comes courtesy of the great Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. And it's not a samurai film, the genre that brought him worldwide fame, but a contemporary crime drama called High and Low, released in March of 63 in Japan, and here, somewhat inauspiciously, just 4 days after JFK was assassinated. So it didn't make quite the splash it might have in the US as far as box office, although it did get excellent reviews. Now, Kurosawa, as I said, is famous for his samurai films, 2 of which, Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, were successfully adapted for Western audiences, forming the basis for The Magnificent Seven and Sergio Leone's Fistful of Dollars, respectively. But until the mid-60s, Kurosawa alternated between samurai films and tales of contemporary Japan. The best of the latter, in my opinion, is the intensely moving Ikiru from 1952, about a terminally ill Tokyo bureaucrat and his final quest for meaning. It's loosely based on Tolstoy's novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And speaking of source material, when looking for material to adapt, Kurosawa was open to anything. Exalted works of high literature by people like Tolstoy, Maxim Gorky, and Shakespeare, or popular fiction, as in the case of High and Low, which is based on one of Ed McBain's popular 87th Precinct novels called King's Ransom, published in 1959. But in all of his adaptations, including this one, no matter the source, high or low, Kurosawa molded the material to incorporate his own preoccupations and beliefs. So while the first, say, half hour to 45 minutes of High and Low tracks fairly closely with the novel, the rest of the film departs from the novel's plot, and of course, Kurosawa shifted the setting as well, from the quasi-New York City of McBain's novel to Yokohama, a major port city in Japan. Now, the actual Japanese title of this film does not translate as High and Low, but rather as Heaven and Hell. And the film's 2 major sections are divided that way. The first hour, the High or Heaven section, takes place entirely within the lavish, air-conditioned home, which stands alone high on a hilltop, of Kingo Gondo, played by the great Toshiro Mifune. Gondo is a highly driven, wealthy executive with a shoe company, and his house literally looks down on the working-class districts of Yokohama, and worse, the final section of the Low or Hell portion of the film includes a tour of a seedy section of the city crawling with heroin addicts. But the physical position of Gondo's house on that hill is not just symbolic, it is the central engine that drives the plot, which takes place during a sweltering summer, as a young man down below is overcome with rage as he looks up from his modest lodgings, not much more than a shack, at Gondo's air-conditioned palace. Air conditioning was a rare privilege in Japan in 1963, and this young man knows that Gondo's house is air-conditioned because the windows are always closed. So this young man, whose name is Takeuchi, seething with an almost Dostoevskian resentment and a distorted sense of his own victimhood, decides to knock the wealthy Gondo off his heavenly perch and bring him crashing down into hell by kidnapping Gondo's son, his only child, and extorting ransom. And as it turns out, he makes this massive ransom demand at the worst possible time for Gondo, as the executive has secretly orchestrated a leveraged buyout to gain control of the shoe company. So he's mortgaged everything he has. Now, what makes this dilemma far more interesting than a simple kidnapping is that Takeuchi mistakenly kidnaps the wrong child. Not Gondo's son, but the son of Gondo's chauffeur, which leads to a moral conundrum. Will this alpha male executive, who's worked his way up from nothing, be willing to give up everything, not just his position in the company, but all his wealth, to ransom a child not his own? And this moral quandary is what attracted Kurosawa to this material, although it was topically relevant as well, as there had been a string of high-profile kidnappings of children in Japan in the late 50s, early 60s, at least two of whom were brutally murdered. But Kurosawa was always attracted to stories of moral or spiritual awakening, an awakening usually achieved by his protagonists in the wake of some terrible setback. In the case of Akira, a mortal illness, here the loss of material wealth. Now, what's interesting and telling is that in McBain's novel, the executive does not pay the ransom, but he collaborates with the police to defeat the kidnapper anyway. So he risks nothing and still wins, which is not so interesting. Here, after a period of stubborn resistance, Gondo decides to humble himself, to do the right thing, and pay this massive ransom for a child who is not his own. So roughly the first half of the film, and to me the best part, deals with this moral struggle, which takes place entirely within Gondo's home, and which involves many people: his wife, who wants him to pay the ransom, the chauffeur who finally begs him to, a sneaky, disloyal underling who betrays Gondo's suddenly vulnerable position to Gondo's rivals in the corporation, the police, who arrive surreptitiously in a delivery van, and the kidnapper, who calls the house a number of times to taunt Gondo and issue his demands. The second half is quite different, almost a different film, as Gondo recedes into the background and the police take center stage. So at that point, the film basically becomes a police procedural, dealing with process. How do these investigators find a needle in a haystack in this rather large city of Yokohama? Now, the second half is a little unwieldy, and I think with some judicious editing, Kurosawa could have cut the 2-hour, 23-minute duration down closer to 2 hours. But even so, it's fascinating to see how the police are able to track this guy down. And the second part also gives us a chance to see the city, including an actual nightclub with not actors but actual clientele, among them a healthy contingent of off-duty American soldiers. So during the occupation period after World War II, the U.S. assumed control of all the Japanese ports. Now, by '62, when this film was shot, that was no longer true, but the Americans did still control the North Pier of Yokohama, which served as a major staging ground for resupply of U.S. troops during the Korean War, and then the Vietnam War, which was just getting underway when this film was shot. So there's a nice authenticity to that nightclub scene with the American soldiers, some of whom may very well have been on leave from service in Vietnam. But from a technical standpoint, what makes this film, especially the first part, gripping, is Kurosawa's particular style of shooting, a new approach he initiated with this film that he would stick with for the remainder of his career. So the conventional Hollywood method of shooting the opening sequence in Gondo's house would be to get a wide master shot and then medium shots and close-ups of any given scene, shooting in small, prearranged bits with a variety of camera setups, and then stitching those bits together in the editing. But Kurosawa, starting with this film, took a more theatrical approach. He felt he could get better, more realistic performances if he shot entire scenes in essentially one take. using 2 camera setups, one on a crane and the second running on tracks. And so in the editing room, he ended up with just 2 shots of each scene and decided there when to cut from one shot to the other. It's the exact opposite of the way Hitchcock worked. Hitchcock storyboarded and pre-cut every single scene, and during the actual filming, he would get just the shots he needed to fit this preordained plan, partly because that approach made it virtually impossible for the studio to recut his films. But this is why, as Hitchcock often said, he found the actual shooting of his films fairly boring. All the creative work had been done. Whereas Kurosawa, who shared Hitchcock's strong visual sense, was, unlike Hitchcock, very much an actor's director. So even though this theatrical style of shooting required extensive camera rehearsals with the actors, because both cameras are moving constantly, the actors, even though it meant more work, did appreciate working this way. And visually, Kurosawa achieves excellent results. The film is shot with a very wide aspect ratio, and you wouldn't think this ultra-wide frame would be necessary or ideal for interior shots of essentially people talking in a house. But with this combination of the constantly shifting groups of this large cast of characters within the wide frame, and the creative mobility of each of these cameras, he creates an aesthetic in these first half scenes really like no other film. I mean, now they would use a Steadicam, which allows handheld cameras to operate with a fairly smooth result. But I don't think it would look as good, or the camera movements would be as precise. The film is shot in black and white, which feels right to me, and which gives Kurosawa the opportunity to create a striking effect toward the end of the film. A few seconds of momentary, meaningful color. I'll let you discover the reason for that color. But it's an effect that was adopted 30 years later by Steven Spielberg for his black and white film, Schindler's List, where it's used in a much different context, but equally effectively. Moving on from crime drama to crime comedy, with a little romance thrown in, my third-ranked film of 1963, Charade, directed by Stanley Donen and starring Cary Grant in his last great role, and Audrey Hepburn, very appealing here, beautiful, amusing, and vulnerable. And Donen's primary interest in this project was to create a North by Northwest type film. People often call this the best Hitchcock film Hitchcock never made. But instead of a male protagonist being the one in constant jeopardy, as Cary Grant is in that film, to have a female protagonist constantly in jeopardy. And this was the first of 2 films that Audrey Hepburn did in the 60s, where she is repeatedly threatened by a group of sadistic lowlifes. The other being Wait Until Dark, in which she plays a blind woman whose primary antagonist is a cast-against-type Alan Arkin, who plays a hipster psycho named Harry Rote Jr. from Scarsdale. But Hepburn, as it turned out, was very good at conveying terror. Here, for example, when she's trapped in a phone booth and a threatening James Coburn drops lit matches in her lap. And the 2 leads here, each of whom radiate a superabundant star power, have excellent chemistry as well, despite never having met before this film was shot in Paris in the fall and winter of 1962. In fact, one comical sequence in a nightclub was shot during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and everyone was so freaked out by the possibility of the world being blown up that they shut down early, and everyone just watched the coverage on TV. But both leads give excellent, very relaxed performances. They're obviously having fun, and I'm sure it helped that Donen had directed each of them before. Another strong feature is the terrific supporting cast, including a not yet famous Walter Matthau, George Kennedy, and the aforementioned James Coburn. Donen had seen Matthau and Kennedy in a flawed but still worthwhile Kirk Douglas film released the previous year called Lonely Are the Brave, and hired them on the basis of that. And he'd been impressed by Coburn in The Magnificent Seven. And as it turned out, Charade, which was a big hit, was also a major career break for all 3 of those men, and within a few short years, Matthau and Kennedy would receive supporting actor Oscars. Matthau in The Fortune Cookie in '66, and Kennedy for Cool Hand Luke in 1967. Coburn would have to wait until 1997 for his supporting actor Oscar for Affliction, where he plays Nick Nolte's abusive alcoholic father. But here, Matthau is especially hilarious, with subtle bits of scene-stealing business in all his scenes. The first of which, a conversation with Hepburn, takes place in what is ostensibly a CIA office, where he offers her a platter of tiny sandwiches. The options are chicken or liverwurst. And before they shot this scene, Matthau took Donen aside, and he said, listen, would it be all right if I actually ate the sandwiches in this scene? And Donen said, sure, but why? And Matthau said, because I'm funny when I chew. You can hear him saying that. And he is. He's funny when he chews. But of course, with multiple takes, the scene took all day to shoot, so he ended up eating like 40 of these tiny sandwiches. There's also a terrific musical soundtrack by Henry Mancini, who scores both the suspenseful and the romantic scenes with equal brilliance. Wonderful instrumental choices. And the famous title song, which he wrote with lyricist Johnny Mercer, we hear throughout in various forms. Initially an instrumental version over the animated titles by Maurice Binder, which are kind of pre-psychedelic, with bold colors and geometric patterns. Binder did his first film titles ever for Donen in a 1958 film with Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman called Indiscreet. And then, of course, he did the titles for the Bond films. But of all the films on my top 10 list for 63 and 62, this one most evokes the era in which it was made. The quasi-psychedelic credits I mentioned, the Mancini soundtrack with the James Bond guitars, Audrey Hepburn's cool stylishness, the judicious use of split screen at the end, all these elements place us squarely in the early 60s, the Kennedy years. Actually, Kennedy himself, a couple months before his death, saw an early print of this film and loved it. And released as it was just a few weeks after Dallas, it provided a bit of a pick-me-up during a rather bleak holiday season in 1963. But the producers of Charade, the weekend of the assassination, immediately realized they would have to dub in a replacement for 2 lines spoken late in the film, where Hepburn says, "We've got to do something. I mean, any minute now we could be assassinated. Would you do anything like that?" And Grant says, what, assassinate someone? So that, obviously, was a no-go in December of 1963. So they dubbed in the word eliminate to replace it. But now, on TV airings and on the Criterion Blu-ray, the original soundtrack has been restored, and the word assassinate is heard. And speaking of the Blu-ray, due to a legal quirk, Charade, upon its release, immediately entered into the public domain in this country. Somebody screwed up the titles. The film's copyright notice includes neither the word copyright nor the symbol, the C in a circle, just the year, 1963, in Roman numerals. And U.S. law before 1978 required that one of those two be shown in the credits for the film to be copyrighted. So as a result of this unintended public domain status, cheap, grainy copies of film prints, often pan and scan, circulated for years. And even now, if you stream this film, it looks bad. So to truly appreciate the excellent cinematography by the old Hollywood veteran Charles Lang, the Criterion version is really your best bet. Now, there are some superficial flaws in the film that I should point out, mostly involving the dubbing of voices. They just did not do a good job with this, especially in the exterior scenes. The ambient sound is uneven, far too low in some places, and the voices, to my ear at least, were mic'd badly and just, well, the actors sound like they're in a recording studio, which they were, and not outdoors. They also made a rather odd decision. There's a child in the film, a French boy, who looks about 10 years old. And apparently this young actor's accent was too thick, so they decided to dub all his lines. Okay, but they didn't use a boy actor, they used a woman. Now, I didn't actually know that until I heard Donen reveal it in the commentary. But I did know that something just seemed off with that performance, that I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I think that was it. It does not sound like a boy whose voice hasn't changed, it sounds like a woman. So I do think they got a little careless with that element. And then visually, especially in a scene on a boat, there are some blatantly obvious rear projection shots. And the rest of the photography is so good that they do stand out to me. And then one final misgiving is a scene where Cary Grant showers with his suit on, to Audrey Hepburn's alleged amusement. And Cary Grant did not want to do this scene, and they should have trusted him. He kept saying, "Why would my character do this?" Great question. The scene has no purpose, and it just isn't funny. It's like a refugee from those screwball comedies he did back in the 30s that really haven't dated well at all. But these are fairly minor glitches. The star power of the two leads carries what is really one of the most purely enjoyable films of the early 60s. And there's a great line that was quoted in some of the obituaries after Cary Grant died in 1986, where Hepburn says to him during a minor argument, "Do you know what's wrong with you?" And he says, "No, what?" And she gives him this sweet smile and says, "Nothing." And that combination of almost unattainable perfection, of look, of manner, along with a counterbalancing sense of irony and the ability to make fun of himself, it's a pretty unbeatable combination. He was actually concerned about the age difference with Hepburn in this film. He turned 60 during shooting, and she was only 33. So as a condition of his participation, he had the writer adjust the screenplay so her character was the one pursuing his character. He thought the opposite would be unseemly, and they did make that adjustment. But as I said, it was a big hit, very well reviewed, although Bosley Crowther, reviewer for the New York Times for decades, criticized it for its, quote, "grisly touches and gruesome violence," unquote, which it really isn't, certainly not by today's standards. And considering what was coming later in the 60s and early 70s, films like Night of the Living Dead in 68, and certainly The Exorcist in 73, it's just as well that Crowther retired in 67, or was retired. He was sort of put out to pasture by the Times after his critical blasting of Bonnie and Clyde for its violence, a minority view that made him seem out of touch with what was happening in the culture. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1963. So take care, and I'll see you soon.